She never expected the world to turn its back on him. But it did. And the pain of watching him suffer, again and again, cut into her soul deeper than any knife could. She'd seen the looks they gave him, the way strangers shifted their gaze, as if to erase him from their view. Even before they knew his name, they had already decided he was less worthy, that he somehow deserved less kindness, less respect, less humanity. And for her, standing beside him, it felt like being stabbed by 1,000 invisible blades. Every dismissive glance was another confirmation that the world had already judged him, and she had to stand guard against its cruelty. She would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together why a person who brought so much light into her life could be treated with such casual disdain. It didn't make sense. It never made sense. His laughter, his passion, his loyalty, these were treasures. Yet the world saw only the group he belonged to, a group too often made the target of mindless blame. It was as if society had decided that every member of his community carried some hidden flaw, some mark that made them unworthy. Her heart burned every time she watched him forced to prove himself again and again. At work, where he had to fight for every inch of recognition that others seemed to receive so easily. In public spaces, where a single mistake would get magnified while others walked away with no consequences. In line at the grocery store, where suspicious eyes would land on him for no reason other than the group to which he belonged. It was exhausting to witness, a never-ending test of his patience and dignity. She sometimes felt powerless to help him, a silent witness to the 1,000 little humiliations he absorbed with grace he should never have needed to muster. The way he shrugged off an insult, the way he stayed calm when denied an opportunity, the way he carried on despite the invisible barriers people placed in front of him, it filled her with pride, yes, but also with rage. Because he should not have had to bear that burden in the first place. The memories clung to her like heavy chains. The night he came home from a job interview, eyes dim with the same defeated expression he'd worn too many times before. The time a stranger in a store had accused him of something unthinkable, just because he fit their idea of a scapegoat. Each time, she felt her own hope crack a little more, as if society's cruelty toward him was eroding her belief in fairness itself. Sometimes, she wondered how he found the courage to keep trying. The world had tried to break him 100 different ways, and still, he stood tall. It amazed her, but it also scared her. She worried that one day, he might not have the strength to keep fighting, that one day he might give up. And what would be left for him then? She loved him for who he was, all of him, and it terrified her that so many people refused to see him the same way. They reduced him to a single label, a convenient stereotype. They refused to see his mind, his dreams, his kindness. They refused to see his humanity. And every time she saw that rejection play out, it felt like a personal attack on everything she held dear. There were moments when her own frustration boiled over. She'd step forward to defend him, to shield him, to remind the world that he deserved dignity. But he would hold up a hand, stopping her with a quiet look. "I've got this," he'd say. And she would stand back, swallowing the knot in her throat, letting him face the storm alone. She hated that. Hated how he'd grown so used to weathering cruelty by himself. Still, in private, he'd confide in her. The pain. The doubt. The sheer exhaustion of always being judged before even being heard. She would hold him then, holding back tears of her own, trying to pour all the love she had into his wounded spirit. Some nights, he'd fall asleep in her arms, breathing slow and heavy, as if her presence alone could keep the world's bitterness at bay. When they were alone together, he would laugh, really laugh, the sound so bright and free it broke her heart. Because she knew how rare that sound was becoming. The world out there was too ready to stomp out his spark. It crushed her to think that the world might succeed one day. She remembered, with raw clarity, the first time she noticed it happening. They'd been out at a park, enjoying a warm afternoon, when a group of people shot him a look that made her skin crawl. That look, a mixture of suspicion and cold dismissal, haunted her ever since. It was the first time she realized how the world was never going to let him rest. And once she saw it, she could never unsee it. Every time she passed a news story, every time she heard a careless joke, she thought of him. How many others had to go through the same thing? How many hearts had been battered by society's casual cruelty? It felt endless, an ocean of pain that stretched far beyond their own small lives. And yet he kept going. That resilience humbled her. It made her want to be stronger, to stand by him no matter what. If the world was determined to break him down, then she would be there to help build him back up. Over and over, if necessary. His spirit deserved protection, she believed, because he had so much to offer. The way he comforted friends who were hurting, the way he volunteered his time, the way he cared about the people around him, these things made him shine. And if people refused to see that, then it was their loss, not his. Still, it hurt. She couldn't lie to herself about that. Every day brought a new reminder that he had to struggle more than others, simply because of his background. Every moment felt like a balancing act, how to shield him, how to support him, without taking away his agency. How to help him stand tall while acknowledging the constant battle he faced. It wasn't easy. It was never easy. She had learned to hold her tongue in public, to not let her anger explode. Because she knew the world was watching, waiting for any excuse to paint him as the problem. She had to play the role of the calm one, the patient one, even when her insides burned with rage. It was a kind of quiet heroism that no one ever gave her credit for, but she didn't care. She did it for him. On days when he came home crushed by disappointment, she would gather every ounce of love she had, wrapping it around him like a protective blanket. Words of encouragement, gentle reminders of his worth, reminders of his dreams, she offered these freely, hoping they would be enough to get him through another day. Sometimes they were. Sometimes they weren't. But she refused to give up trying. Their love, forged in the fire of a world that refused to accept him, became her anchor. It reminded her of why she had to keep standing up, why she had to keep fighting in small ways. Because if she let society's poison infect her too, then they both would lose. And she refused to let hatred win. Over time, she became an expert at reading the signals. The shift in a stranger's posture. The subtle tone in a colleague's voice. The unspoken judgment behind polite words. These tiny tells became impossible to ignore. She learned to sense them before he even did, bracing herself for the moment when the world would once again show its fangs. And every time it happened, a part of her heart would break. Because how many times could a person be wounded before the scars took over? How long could someone fight to be seen before they lost sight of themselves? She lived in fear of that day, the day he might believe the lies, might see himself through their cruel, twisted lens. No, she told herself. Not on her watch. She would be there, reminding him of his truth. Of who he really was. Of who they really were together. Because their bond was something pure, something that no hate could corrupt, no prejudice could erase. She clung to that hope with all her might. He was worthy. She knew that as surely as she knew her own heartbeat. He was worthy of kindness, respect, and peace. The world could refuse to see it all it wanted, but she would never waver. Not ever. There were moments, late at night, when they lay side by side, hands clasped, staring into the dark. In those moments, everything else seemed to fade away. The labels. The judgments. The endless battles. It was just them, two people holding on to each other in a world that tried so hard to tear them apart. Sometimes he would whisper, almost like a confession, "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." And she would squeeze his hand, steady and strong. "Then lean on me," she'd reply. And he would. And they'd fall asleep like that, bound together against the world. It was in those fragile spaces, in the quiet after the storm, that she found her courage. If he could keep trying, so could she. If he could believe in a future worth fighting for, she could too. It was their shared promise, to never let the world steal away their humanity. Every morning brought fresh challenges. She watched him put on the armor he needed to survive, watched him build up a smile he might not truly feel, watched him prepare for a day in a world that did not love him the way he deserved. And every morning, she vowed to do everything she could to lift him back up when he returned. Because she would not let him fall alone. Her anger became her resolve. Her heartbreak became her mission. She would channel every ache, every moment of frustration, into something stronger, a steady, unshakable devotion to him, to his dreams, to their shared hope for a kinder world. People liked to tell her that things would get better. That prejudice was dying out, that the future was brighter. Maybe they believed it. But she had seen too much to let herself believe blindly. Change was not guaranteed. It had to be fought for. Again and again. And so she would fight, side by side with him, even if no one else understood why. Because he mattered. Because he deserved to breathe freely, to live fully, to be seen in all his beauty and brilliance. Every time the world tried to push him down, she would be there, hands ready to pull him back up. As long as she had breath in her body, she would stand with him. That was her promise. That was her truth. No matter how long it took, no matter how heavy the burden became, she would keep carrying the flame of their hope. Because that hope was stronger than any hatred, stronger than any prejudice, stronger than the world's cruelty. She would not surrender to fear. She would not bow to injustice. She would hold her head high, side by side with the man she loved, and together they would walk through the fire, unbroken. And maybe, just maybe, one day the world would learn to see him the way she did. Until then, she would keep fighting. Every day, another tiny piece of her faith in the world seemed to die. And it was because of how they treated him. There were moments she thought she could no longer stand it, the thousand little ways society reminded him he was an outsider. She resented it with a fire that burned through every cell of her body. She resented how people pretended to be fair while carrying their silent judgments. She resented how their rules shifted beneath his feet, never giving him steady ground to build on. It was as if the world insisted on shrinking him, on keeping him in a place where his voice could never fully carry. And in that constant undermining, she saw a cruelty so casual it terrified her. He was always forced to be twice as good, twice as careful, just to be treated half as kindly. It filled her with a sharp, simmering resentment she could barely contain. Sometimes, she wanted to scream at them, to grab strangers by the shoulders and shake them until they saw what she saw. But there was no point. Their minds were made up before he even opened his mouth. They saw him through the warped glass of prejudice, never noticing the depth of his spirit or the warmth of his heart. The injustice of that gnawed at her, day and night. Each time he came home defeated by another setback, her anger grew. It wasn't fair. It would never be fair. She resented having to console him over things he never should have had to endure. She resented that she had to become his shield, always on guard, because the world refused to accept him for who he was. She resented that love had to become a fortress instead of a celebration. She remembered one afternoon when they had walked through a busy street, and people parted around him, cold and dismissive, as though his mere presence demanded explanation. The shame he carried afterward was like a poison that seeped into their home, making the air heavy and sad. That night, she had cried alone in the bathroom, the resentment so strong it threatened to split her apart. How could the world do that to someone so gentle, so full of dreams? It was in these moments that she realized how hard it was to hold on to hope. The world had taught her, again and again, to expect the worst. It had taught him to brace for rejection even before it arrived. And that was a lesson she could never forgive society for forcing on him. It stole so much of his joy, so much of his peace, and she resented that theft with a fury she barely knew how to name. In small ways, her resentment would surface, in the tightness of her voice when someone made a sly remark, in the way she clenched her jaw when strangers stared too long, in the cold distance she kept from people who dared to belittle him. There was no room for polite acceptance anymore. She refused to pretend everything was fine when everything was so deeply, painfully wrong. Sometimes, he would ask her to let it go. To let it slide. But how could she? Letting it slide felt like betraying him. Letting it slide felt like telling the world it was acceptable to keep wounding him. Her heart simply wouldn't allow it. Every fiber of her being demanded justice, even if justice never arrived. She carried her resentment like an ember, hidden but hot. It gave her a reason to keep fighting. It reminded her that what they had, their love, their shared dreams, was worth protecting. That ember kept her from going numb, from growing apathetic, from giving up. There were days when he seemed to fold inward, smaller and smaller, as if trying to occupy less space. That broke her. He should have been free to shine, to take up space, to be bold and loud and proud. But the world had pressed him into a corner, and she resented every hand that pushed him there. In their quiet moments together, she tried to pull him back to himself. She told him stories about the future, stories where no one questioned his worth, where no one tried to silence him. In those stories, he stood tall and unstoppable. And each time, she hoped he believed her just a little bit more. It was a strange thing, she thought, to love someone who the world refused to love. It made her feel like she was fighting an invisible enemy every single day. The faceless crowd, the quiet bigotry, the endless suspicion, it was all a poison. And she resented how easily that poison spread, how willing people were to swallow its lies. She also resented how it stole precious time from them. Time they could have spent laughing, dreaming, building a life without fear. Instead, they spent so many hours recovering from wounds the world delivered without a second thought. That loss of peace was something she could never forgive. And yet, despite all her resentment, she refused to let it transform her into someone bitter. She would not allow their ignorance to corrode her love. It was a delicate balance, staying warm and open with him while holding the world at bay. But she managed, because he was worth it. Some nights, when the resentment threatened to suffocate her, she would go for a long walk alone, letting the night air calm her spirit. She would remind herself that her purpose was to lift him up, not to drag him down with her anger. And she would return home steadier, ready to be his partner again. Their love, tested by countless challenges, was stronger for all it had survived. But she could not deny the toll it took. The way resentment built up over months, years, until even a passing comment from a stranger felt like an earthquake. The way it made her question whether humanity could ever truly change. The way it made her ache for a different world, one they might never see. Yet she would not abandon him. No matter how many battles lay ahead, she would fight them by his side. If the world refused to see his worth, then she would keep showing him, every single day, that he was worthy. She would not let resentment destroy what they had, but she also would not pretend everything was fine. He deserved the truth, and so did she. The truth was harsh, society had failed him. Again and again. And that failure left scars on both of them. But in those scars, they had written their own story of defiance. They had chosen each other, over and over, despite every attempt to break them. That choice was their rebellion. Their promise. And even if the world would never celebrate it, she would. Because loving him was the most courageous thing she had ever done, and resenting the world that hurt him was the price she would gladly pay. When they tried to silence him, something inside her shattered, and it would never be the same again. Her resentment had grown so constant it felt like a second heartbeat. Day after day, she watched him face obstacles that no one else seemed to even notice. But this time, it was worse. This time, it was the system itself, the institutions meant to protect them, that showed their cracks, letting him fall through again and again. And in those failures, her rage was reborn. One afternoon, they waited at a government office, paperwork in hand, hoping for a simple service. The line was endless, and when they finally reached the counter, the clerk's polite smile turned guarded the moment he stepped forward. Questions that should have been routine became interrogations. Requirements shifted, documents changed, and she could almost see the invisible wall being built in real time. It was bureaucracy wielded like a weapon. She resented it with every breath. Her anger deepened when she realized how many other people faced the same trap, an invisible maze that shifted the moment you dared to think you belonged. Rules that seemed to shift, procedures that were applied unevenly, all wrapped in a veneer of fairness but designed to keep some people outside. It was a flaw so vast in the system that it felt like a betrayal of everything America claimed to stand for. And her resentment, fed by each fresh humiliation, grew sharper. They tried again, applying for a housing program meant to help working families. The system lost their application not once, but twice. When they questioned it, they were told to wait, to resubmit, to be patient. She saw the look in the staff's eyes, that same dismissiveness, the same quiet doubt. It was not a glitch. It was a pattern. And that pattern was as damaging as any open hatred. She would lie awake, remembering the thousands of other families caught in the same web, a web woven from red tape and half-kept promises. It was a cruelty in slow motion. She resented how the government systems, designed to lift up people in need, could instead grind them down, wearing away their will. The weight of it pressed on her, night after night. What burned most was seeing him start to believe he wasn't worth the fight anymore. The agencies, the paperwork, the unreturned calls, all of it chipped away at him. His hope drained with each new obstacle. And that was the most painful twist of all, watching him doubt himself because the system refused to see him. It terrified her. An emotional storm hit its peak one evening, when he came home after yet another wasted day in court, trying to defend his right to something that should have been guaranteed. She found him sitting alone in the dark, shoulders slumped, breathing shallow. He looked at her with eyes so lost, so hollow, that she thought her heart might stop. That was when her resentment reached its breaking point. She walked to him, took his hands, and made him look at her. She told him, through tears, that they would not let this defeat them. She told him his worth was not measured by a broken system, and she promised she would stand by him, even if the entire world tried to push him away. In that moment, something shifted, their bond grew fierce, unstoppable. They were no longer just surviving. They were resisting. That night, she could not sleep. Her mind raced through every moment society had failed him, how agencies, policies, and laws claimed to help but too often refused to see him as a human being. She resented how those flaws robbed him of dignity, how they forced him to jump through hoops just to claim the smallest piece of peace. No one should have to live that way. In the weeks that followed, their struggle continued. The medical system, too, showed its failings. A simple appointment became a trial, with endless forms and insurance denials, as if every step had been designed to test whether he truly deserved care. The quiet, professional language of those denials only deepened her fury. How could a country so proud of its fairness leave him in this maze? The twist came when he almost gave up. There was a day he told her he was finished fighting, that he could not go on. The words chilled her to her bones. For a moment, she was terrified that all the hate, all the barriers, had finally crushed his spirit. But then, something deep inside her refused to let him go. She gathered every ounce of her own battered hope, lifted him up, and refused to let him fall. That was her emotional turning point. She would never allow this system to swallow him whole. After that night, she felt a new clarity. Her resentment turned into a mission. If the government was flawed, then she would learn every rule, every loophole, every right he was entitled to. If society would not protect him, she would. Her mind became sharp with purpose, her heart steady with rage that refused to fade. She researched late into the night, refusing to let bureaucracy be the last word on their dreams. She found allies, people who had also been burned by the same broken systems, and together they built a network of support, sharing information, sharing courage. That sense of community became a light in their darkness. They were no longer alone, and that alone changed everything. Still, her resentment simmered. Every day brought another reminder, a news story, a political speech, a cold policy that promised fairness but delivered nothing. She saw the way officials stood before cameras and talked of equality, while behind closed doors, they let countless people slip through the cracks. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, and it fed a righteous anger inside her that would never die. But even in that rage, she refused to hate blindly. She refused to become what she fought against. Instead, she transformed that pain into determination. If the system was imperfect, then they would outsmart it, together. If the world refused to welcome him, then they would carve out their own place, piece by piece. Some nights, after long hours of battles fought and small victories won, they would sit together quietly, hands intertwined, heart steady. She would look at him and know that he was still standing because of the love they shared. And in that love, she found enough strength to face the next day. There was no simple fix. She knew that. But they would keep going. They would keep pushing. Because giving up was not an option. Their lives mattered. Their dreams mattered. And no imperfect system would ever have the right to take that away from them. Her resentment would remain, a constant reminder of why they had to keep fighting. And as long as she drew breath, she would never let the world forget what it had tried to steal from him. They thought they could keep him small. But they had no idea how far her love, and her fury, could reach. She had grown tired of counting the ways society failed him. Each day seemed to reveal a new cruelty, a new reason for the world to tell him he didn't belong. What tore at her most was how casually these rejections were delivered, a word, a gesture, a rule twisted to suit another purpose. It was as if the air itself carried a silent message that he was unwelcome. No matter how hard he worked, no matter how kind he was, people seemed determined to overlook him or dismiss him altogether. She saw it in their eyes, the way they barely registered his presence until they decided to judge him. That judgment was the sharpest blade of all. It left wounds that never fully healed. She resented that. She resented that so many were content to let good people fall through the cracks. Every day, she felt that resentment press against her ribs, hot and sharp, demanding action. But what action could she take, when the world itself seemed so vast, so immovable? Her own powerlessness fed a slow, simmering rage. It built up over months, over years, until even small slights felt like thunderbolts. A bank clerk who double-checked his ID. A neighbor who hesitated before returning a greeting. A coworker who, accidentally, left him off an invitation list. Alone, each moment might have seemed harmless. Together, they built a wall that tried to keep him on the outside, looking in. She could not stand it. And she refused to accept it. Their love deserved better. He deserved better. That certainty became her anchor, a reason to keep moving, to keep hoping, even when her anger nearly swallowed her whole. They faced challenge after challenge, and still he refused to become bitter. That, more than anything, made her heart ache. He forgave the world over and over, carrying a patience that seemed impossible. And though she admired him, she also burned for him. Burned with the fury of knowing he should never have to be so patient in the first place. One day, she watched him speak up at a community meeting, only to have his concerns brushed aside without a second thought. The pain on his face nearly broke her. It was a pain she knew too well, mirrored in countless moments over the years. And that night, she could no longer hold back. She let her resentment pour out, tears mixing with fury, telling him that he deserved to be heard, to be valued, to be seen. She promised she would not rest until that happened. An ache settled deep inside her, one she could not easily soothe. Because each slight felt personal, as if the world was attacking not just him but every hope she carried for their future. Each insult felt like an attempt to erase everything they had built. And the more society tried to erase him, the more she vowed to make him visible. She began to stand taller, to challenge dismissive remarks, to call out prejudice where it lurked. Some people looked at her with confusion, some with discomfort, but she didn't care. Silence had never saved them. Silence had only made the walls higher. If she had to become a warrior to defend him, then that was what she would be. At times, the cost of her rage weighed heavily. It meant distancing herself from people she once called friends. It meant stepping away from family members who refused to understand. That isolation stung, but never as much as watching him be diminished. She would gladly trade anything to keep his spirit whole. As the seasons turned, her resentment changed shape. It was no longer a wild, shapeless storm. It was focused, a steady flame that lit her path. She refused to let the world take him from her. Refused to let their love be treated as lesser. And in that resolve, she found a sense of purpose. There were days when hope felt out of reach. When headlines screamed of injustice, when conversations at work revealed how deep biases still ran, when neighbors spoke in coded language that left no doubt about their true feelings. It was exhausting. And each fresh reminder of prejudice renewed her resentment like a fresh wound. But each night, when she lay beside him, feeling his heartbeat, she found reason to keep going. He was still here. Still fighting. Still believing. That alone was worth everything. One winter evening, an unexpected twist nearly shattered them both. He was stopped on his way home by an authority figure who saw only his label, not his humanity. A simple misunderstanding spiraled out of control, leaving him humiliated, frightened, and on the brink of despair. When he came through the door that night, shaking, she felt something inside her break for good. The resentment transformed into a vow. She would do everything in her power to change this, no matter how long it took. Together, they navigated complaints, appeals, letters, the endless maze of defending yourself against a system determined to doubt you. Each moment felt like wading through quicksand. But she stayed at his side, her fury now a steady flame, refusing to let him be silenced. She saw clearly now how fragile fairness could be, how easily it was twisted, how quickly a mistake could become a life sentence for someone like him. And that knowledge haunted her. It haunted her because she realized how many others suffered the same fate in silence, never telling their stories, never getting the chance to heal. In that realization, she found a strange kind of strength. Her resentment was not just for him anymore. It was for every person who had been forced to shrink, to apologize for existing, to hide their brilliance just to stay safe. She would speak for them, too. She would carry that torch forward. As spring arrived, she looked back on how far they had come. Their scars were many, but their love had survived them all. He was still kind, still hopeful, and still hers. And that was worth fighting for, worth every ounce of rage she carried. But what if the world wasn't done testing them yet? What if the hardest choice of all still lay ahead? She knew their journey was not over. And even as the days brightened and the air warmed, she kept her guard up. The world had shown its sharp edges too many times for her to believe their troubles were behind them. But she had changed, stronger, bolder, unwilling to let her resentment fade into weakness. Every moment of cruelty had taught her that their love was an act of rebellion. Every time he smiled despite the world's coldness, he proved that they could not be erased. She would hold on to that proof, guard it fiercely, and build their dreams on its foundation. If the world wanted to keep testing them, so be it. She was ready. She was ready for the next battle, but nothing could have prepared her for what came next. It was no longer a matter of if the world would challenge them, but when. Every step they took seemed shadowed by some new reminder that he would always be forced to prove himself. She had stopped being surprised by society's coldness, but the ache it left behind never truly dulled. It was a wound that refused to close. Her resentment had matured by now. It was no longer a wild firestorm but a steady, focused flame. She knew where to direct it, how to turn it into action, how to protect him from the harshest blows. Yet even that knowledge did not soothe her heart. There was always a part of her that wished the world would simply see him as he was, rather than as a label. Some days, she felt almost numb. The constant repetition of prejudice, of subtle insults and small humiliations, had trained her to brace for the worst. But numbness frightened her more than rage. Because rage kept her fighting, but numbness threatened to let cruelty pass without protest. She refused to allow that. A spring afternoon brought a fresh reminder of how deep society's flaws ran. He had applied for a small business permit, something hundreds of people received every month with barely a glance. But when it was his turn, the questions multiplied, the forms grew longer, and the deadline seemed impossibly tight. She watched his confidence falter as the obstacles mounted. That day, she could barely contain the storm raging inside her. The worst part was seeing him apologize for things that were not his fault, for rules written to trip him up, for a culture that refused to trust him. His shoulders seemed to curl inward, as if bracing for another blow. She wanted to reach across the counter and shout, "Look at him. Look at how hard he works. Look at what he survived." But of course, she couldn't. That night, she lay awake tracing the ceiling with tired eyes, imagining all the dreams he might one day let go of because the world kept placing its heavy foot on his back. The thought was unbearable. She would not allow it. Their future depended on her resilience as much as his. Over the next few weeks, she studied every regulation, called every contact she had, researched every legal right he possessed. If they wouldn't open the doors for him, then she would find a way to build a new door altogether. She would not accept defeat, not when he was giving every ounce of his strength to stay hopeful. What weighed on her most was how many others shared the same burden, unseen and unheard. Whenever she looked around, in grocery stores, in waiting rooms, in line at city offices, she saw faces carrying the same exhaustion, the same silent plea for fairness. She wanted to reach out to each one, to tell them they were not alone. But she barely had the energy to carry their own fight, let alone heal the wounds of so many strangers. Yet it made her resolve even harder. If they could win their own fight, maybe others would see that it was possible. Maybe their struggle could become a lantern, lighting the way for someone else lost in the same darkness. That thought kept her steady on days when the obstacles felt impossible to overcome. One evening, as she helped him review paperwork for the third time in a single week, he looked up at her with tired eyes and asked, "Do you think they'll ever just see me?" The question broke something inside her. She had no easy answer. But she leaned forward, took his hands, and whispered, "If they can't, then we will make them." And she meant every word. Then came an unexpected twist, an opportunity he had dreamed of for years, a chance to pitch his ideas to a group of investors who might change their lives. But she could see in his eyes the doubt that had been planted by years of rejection. He almost didn't go. Almost let fear win. That terrified her more than anything. She refused to let society steal that moment from him. For 3 days, she practiced with him, rehearsing his story, highlighting his skills, reminding him of his worth. Her resentment became fuel, burning away every obstacle in their path. When the day finally arrived, she watched him walk through the doors with his head high. And she knew, in that instant, that even if the world never gave him a fair chance, he would demand it anyway. The hours waiting for news felt endless. She paced the living room, barely breathing, praying that this time the world would not crush him. When he returned, smiling, holding a letter that promised a future, she nearly collapsed from relief. They had done it. They had beaten back the shadows, at least for today. That triumph did not erase all the harm. It did not heal every wound. But it showed them that change was possible, no matter how small. It reminded them that hope was still worth chasing. As they sat together that night, holding each other close, she felt the old resentment stirring, reminding her that there would be other battles, other tests. But for this moment, she let herself feel proud, of him, of them, of everything they had survived together. The world had tried to bury him under its labels, but he had climbed out. He had risen, and she had risen with him. And that, she knew, was only the beginning. If you believe in love that refuses to break, if you believe every voice deserves to be heard, then stand with them. Share their story, and never let it be forgotten.